Great. Hi everyone, I'm June McCartan. I apologize, I'm having trouble with Teams today, so I'll be calling in. This is the third training of the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. Today we're going to be focused on open space, subdivisions, cluster housing, conservation housing, a basket of sort of cognate terms, a zoning tool that gets called many things, but it carries the same principles across names. Noah, if you would, next slide. Yeah, so just to give you the logistics for the day, we're going to do a little bit of a presentation, first myself and then Jacob LaFontaine from the town of Salem. And then we'll open it up to a question and answer. That portion, we're using a webinar format today in Teams, so that portion, you'll have to raise your hand if you want to ask it. So there's a button towards the bottom of your screen that is a sort of hand icon that you can use to raise your hand, and we'll sort of elevate you so that you can ask your question by voice. Otherwise, either during the Q&A session or during the presentation, you can write questions into the chat, and we can answer those. I think, Noah, if you would, as long as I'm not sort of formally in this Teams meeting, I might ask you to monitor the chat and sort of let us know what questions are being asked in there.
Yep, happy to do that.
Great, thank you. So yeah, the chat button is also indicated at the bottom of your screen. There's like a little speech bubble. Just to let you know, we will be recording this meeting, or we're recording already, and we'll post a recording of that online so that you or your colleagues can review it later. So next slide. This is a presentation, a series of presentations from something called the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. But what is that? So I'll give a brief introduction to what the Toolbox is. Next slide. It's a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. So these are specifically local things that local governments can do, either broad strategic approaches to specific regulatory approaches that local governments can take up. And we're specifically framing them around housing production. That's the sort of goal of this toolbox, is to focus on production. Today, we're focused on cluster zoning, cluster housing, which is a great example of how there's overlaps with other subject areas. So things like conservation, open space and recreation, and even other housing related subjects like affordable housing. We touched on those in the toolbox, but the focus, the drive behind the toolbox and of this presentation is specifically housing production. So next slide. The toolbox lives in two formats. The first is a PDF, which has been circulating for a little bit. And it includes all 20 planning and zoning strategies as something you can print or just have saved in your desktop or wherever. And that can be found at our website, nhhousingtoolbox.org. And next slide. That toolbox actually went live. So the website, nhhousingtoolbox.org, actually went live last week. And that includes an interactive version of all of the information you'll find in that PDF. So it's something that you can, if you're particularly interested in sharing information about one tool, you can use that to link to that tool. Or if you're interested in browsing just in a more convenient web-based format, that's an option as well. So that's at nhhousingtoolbox.org. Next slide. So just a little more about this. It was part of the statewide regional housing needs assessment process that was conducted simultaneously by all of the regional planning commissions. it was funded through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. So it's sort of federal money going through the state. It was led by a subcommittee of staff from the regional planning commissions and New Hampshire Housing, and it was facilitated by the Office of Planning and Development, the state agency. So that's NOAA with us today. There were two consultants. First, Out with Studio, that's where I come from. And that we handled sort of the planning content and visual identity, sort of taking all the information that we had from different staff people working on the project and consolidating into one place in a sort of digestible format. And then Boku was our web design and development consultant and made us this awesome website. So next slide. The Toolbox is really trying to answer a short series of questions. So what is each tool? How can that tool help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? And what does implementation look like at sort of a high level? And then where can you learn more? So the idea is that each tool can be basically a starting point for different people in the community, who can use this to get up to speed on a specific topic, as well as see the broad overview of topics that they can look at, the broad overview of the tools they can look at, and sort of go from there, sort of use that as a starting roadmap, and go build out from there. So next slide. As I mentioned, the audience for this is really people working in and around local government. So we thought, of course, this would be local government staff, people working in planning or conservation, or maybe even human services or something like that, so sort of staff level folks. There's also members of the planning board or select board who might be volunteers, legislative body members, whether it's city council or town meeting, local advocates who might not have a formal role in government, but sort of very active in their community. These are all folks who would be relevant in using the toolbox. And again, the goal is to really save time on upfront research, give people some examples, and let them get creative with it. Next slide. And then we've been pretty loose in our organization of the tools. In the PDF, for instance, they're organized alphabetically. We don't want to say they're some tools are only good for some communities, while a completely different set of tools are good for other communities, because all of these are good options for different towns and cities. We did want to provide some sense of organization, though, so we do offer this sort of issues addressed category that we've applied to all the tools. Ways for people to really think about what problems their community is facing, or what things do they want to prioritize today, and sort of drill down in the tools that can address those issues. So that's the ones we include here are housing options, so how to add more housing diversity, housing costs, so sort of the cost of, say, a market rate housing unit, affordable housing, so that's sort of formally deed restricted, affordable and workforce housing that meets certain rent or sales price thresholds and are only available to certain income eligible households. Sustainable housing, so how to make housing that's more environmentally sustainable, less resource consumptive. Specifically multi-generational options, so understanding that there's a need for housing that will accommodate families of multiple generations, people who are either taking in younger people in their family who might not have housing readily available to them, or people taking care of grandparents, sort of those cases that don't fit neatly into conventional single-family housing. Infrastructure concerns, so where is obviously, there are infrastructure constraints when it comes to housing, road access, water and wastewater access, power, et cetera. And so understanding those constraints, how can we either expand the ability of communities to provide that infrastructure or just be more efficient in the infrastructure that already exists? And then tools that really apply to redevelopment. So when there's maybe a vacant building or vacant lot or a building that's not being used to its fullest capacity, how can we redevelop those areas in a way that also addresses the housing crisis? All right, so today we're specifically talking about cluster housing. Next slide. And here in this section, I'm first going to just like run through how we think about things in the toolbox. So each tool in the toolbox has like a number of categories of information we touch on, whether it's implementation or what it's best used for. And here we're going to give a kind of version of that. We'll also give you a flavor of what the rest of the toolbox is like. So next slide. So cluster housing, as I mentioned before, it's called a number of different things: conservation housing, open space development, open space preservation development, and all of these are sort of different names for a similar suite of zoning tools that many communities in New Hampshire have availed themselves of. So Jacob from the town of Salem will give a nice map of that, but it's sort of some form of this, cluster housing, conservation housing, has been adopted by many local governments in New Hampshire. And they basically do a similar set of things. So they're a different way of permitting subdivisions where homes are clustered on small lots and large swaths of open space are preserved for conservation and or common use. So a traditional subdivision, might plat out the homes, plat out the land, the individual land parcels, such that they either, evenly, more or less evenly divide the land, or perhaps meet a relatively large minimum lot size requirement. Put a big house in the middle of it, and you need to make the house pretty big to justify the large land size. And to make it all work, you might have to, take down more mature trees than you might otherwise want to. You might have to add more road and wastewater infrastructure than you might otherwise have to if you weren't governed by that traditional conventional subdivision logic, which sort of creates these big lots, big houses, and lots of infrastructure. So cluster housing is a way of saying, okay, take that one big tract of land, and instead of more or less evenly dividing it up into large lots, put homes on relatively smaller lots in a way that preserves the natural features that exist on the site. So maybe it's wetlands or forests or water features. And in that way, you'll use less infrastructure. You won't need to sort of overbuild in order to justify the land cost per unit. You can just sort of do things in a way that's more logical given the tract of land you have. Now, there are some elements of these laws that make some more successful than others in terms of their adoption by actual landowners and developers. Certainly, reduced infrastructure requirements help. But then there's also things like density bonuses for, say, good design or some measure of affordability. There's reduced development site requirements. So if it's 25 acres versus 10 acres, there's going to be more opportunities to do this sort of development. And then permitting in such a way that, can be more streamlined. Maybe it's more along the lines of like a site plan review or a preliminary design process with, endorsements from city staff or town staff or what have you, rather than a conditional use or a special exception. So those are all ways that make some of these bylaws more adopted than others. So a lot of communities have them on the books, but a lot of communities haven't seen one come forward, maybe ever, maybe in 20 years, even if they're seeing sort of conventional subdevelopment move forward, a subdivision development. So that's sort of an overview and really the quick hits of what makes what we think a more successful cluster housing ordinance. Next slide. It can help, if you have sort of relatively large, complex sites, a lot of open space and agricultural resources or just natural resources that you'd like to conserve. It can create smaller and potentially more affordable subdivision lots. It sort of depends on how it shakes out in land pricing. And of course, there's because we're in a housing crisis, there's really high demand, but you're essentially not locking in a really high price because it's so land consumptive and the sort of market dynamics of that. It can require less infrastructure costs, and those lower costs can be passed on to residents. It can reduce footprints and the impacts on stormwater. So there's less concerns about stormwater on the site or pooling, drainage, all of that. It can provide on-site outdoor recreation spaces for children and seniors, and Jacob is going to have some nice examples of how the recreation versus conservation discussion comes into play. But you're essentially taking what would otherwise be an unamenitized subdivision and turning it into something more potentially usable by people in the area. You can connect to trails and other conserved areas. So this is admittedly a sort of piecemeal process, development by development, but with a right strategy, you can sort of connect different open spaces that already exist, or you can start to build a cohesive system. And then you can increase the overall housing supply with a focus on smaller, less prevalent housing types. So it lends itself to the sort of housing diversity that many communities are looking for. Next slide. Now, how do you actually go about this? So we think of this, each of these tools from sort of planning to adoption at the, or sort of planning to implementation, and we try to give a broad outline of what that might look like. Here, it's connects to existing master plan goals or an ongoing master plan process. So if you have goals around conservation, if you have goals around housing production, sort of just making that connection explicit as you start to explore that option. And then, of course, if you're doing a master plan, sort of explore this and potentially include it as a recommendation. The next step that we think is really useful is identifying areas that are appropriate for cluster housing. So go through and catalog the natural or agricultural resources that you think are really important to the community for conservation. And we note here that particularly those near recent development, recent subdivisions, or even those that the landowner, they've come and kick the tires with you about what's really possible here, and so start to catalog what those opportunities are. Catalog who the potential players might be in terms of landowners or developers in your community, who you can really start to think about this as opportunities for them. You should engage the public on a conversation on conservation and alternative development models like cluster, and how a well-tuned cluster ordinance can play into the community's goals like conservation. You really start to air this through a public discussion. And if everyone's comfortable and sort of you don't think it'll ruffle any feathers, maybe start talking about what those specific sites could be. Craft an ordinance that allows cluster through local zoning and subdivision laws. And you need to look at density, dimensional considerations, and permitting schemes. Sort of go back here, like what's the density compared to the conventional density? If it's the same as conventional density, but it requires a much longer conditional use process versus something by right, like is anyone really going to adopt that? If the open space requirements or certain infrastructure requirements or dimensional requirements are all in some way more onerous than a conventional subdivision, how is that really going to work in reality? And then let's say you've crafted it, you've adopted it through town meeting. Maybe you already have one on the books, but you're doing this process of reconsideration and trying to figure out how to make this work. You've adopted it. The next step is to really promote it. If you have this regulatory opportunity in your hands, but it's new, it's relatively untested in your community, like you're going to need to push for that. And easier said than done, everyone's busy, but sort of making space for that process of having the conversation with the landowner is going to be really important. Next slide, please. Typical considerations that are going to go through your head as you look at how this might work for you. Typically, it's included in its own use. So a use in the use table, you might see in the use table something like open space preservation development, or they might call it cluster, they might call it conservation, but it's going to be sort of separate from single family development. It's going to be its sort of own thing. And typically that's going to be connected to a special section of the zoning that's going to specify all of the dimensional rules and other conditions, things that are really only going to apply to a cluster zoning approach. So, as you consider how an ordinance might be drafted, to sort of keep that in mind, is that like you have your rules in the books right now, but the cluster is going to, in some ways, override the rules of those zones. As I sort of talked about a little earlier, by right permitting with administrative review and or site plan review will lead to greater adoption. Conditional use permitting can discourage adoption, particularly if conventional development isn't subject to that same permitting regime. You at least want to have parity between conventional subdivision and open space preservation subdivision. You don't want to tip the scales away from cluster through just the permitting regime. All that said, by right permitting can be a little bit scary for some communities, particularly those that have had a lot of discretion in the way that they work. So it's important to note that there's ways to do by right permitting that still involve considerable input from stakeholders. The application procedure itself should not be overly burdensome, especially compared to conventional development. So even just getting the application in, sometimes that can be a very difficult process. So we'll see an example of this a little bit later, but in many communities, you have to come up with a yield plan that does like a essentially almost designs the full subdivision at like a schematic level in order to figure out how many units are available, and then the application can go into a review, and all of that can be very discouraging to some landowners who either might be new at this, or they're just looking at the process and being like, this is a lot of money up front before I even know if it's going to work. And then the method for calculating density should be relatively simple. It should not require those near complete schematic designs in order to figure out what the density could be. Some communities make this work. That sort of schematic level design. They somehow, through pre-application consultation with town staff, they can sort of lighten the load there. But there are other ways to do it, like formulas, with considerations for wetlands or other sort of features that you want to factor in. It can be really good to incorporate really basic design standards into the zoning and to ensure architectural consistency with your community. So things like, roof pitches or some consideration of materials. But, you shouldn't write it so that you can't have flexibility once it comes time to proposal, especially in things like dimensional rules, in order to deal with difficult sites. And we'll see some examples of those. If the open spaces are open to the public, try to provide some separate access points for residents, different access points for residents than the general public would have, as a way to sort of make it feel more inviting to the general public, and also not just to have the residents feel like they're being, their space is being, come upon. Again, try to connect open spaces to existing conservation resources to try to build a whole conservation network and have those synergies. And then consider requiring a design-oriented process in which developers first design open space based on clear criteria, then site the homes, the roads, the trails, and finally lot lines. And this prevents, sort of little tiny slabs of leftover open space that aren't really useful as recreation. They don't have quite the same conservation benefits as a well-designed space would have. So there are ordinances which sort of lay out the process by which and open space conservation development should happen, starting from the natural features and finally ending with how it all comes together as parcels. I want to jump to Jacob and the town of Salem sooner or later, but I'll just mention a few case studies we go through in the toolbox itself. Noah, if you advance to the sort of Terrell Farm slide. So this is an example from Nashua. It had been sort of like a long-standing family farm, been in the family for generations, and there was the thought consideration into well, we really feel a connection to this land and sort of don't want to see it just completely wiped away. But how do we do that with the rules of the books? And I thought this was a really nice example, in part because it's relatively small. So they were able to do both of this, little clusters of homes, and preserve a lot of wooded areas and open spaces in relatively small footprint. So we see a lot of examples of larger footprint cluster developments, and certainly a lot of laws on the books, cluster development laws on the books that require large land parcels. And this is one that I think, it's not a small site, but it's also not an expansive one. Next slide. This is a cool one from Peterborough. I think, interestingly, it wasn't permitted through the formal open space preservation rules on the books. So it was through sort of a different zoning tool that was implementing similar rules. But this is an interesting one because it really combines that housing development with a sort of almost intentional community feel, where it's a neighborhood and the sort of agricultural aspect of it is sort of worked into who lives there and who wants to live there. So it's again a sort of way of amenitizing a space and creating a market for something that might not otherwise exist. And then next slide is the development in Pennsylvania, sort of ex-urban Philadelphia, I'd say. It's called the Brandywine at Thornbury. And this is it's an interesting law in the books there because it requires a certain amount of active open space and a certain amount of sort of conservation space, as well as some measure of connections within the community. So to make sure that folks in the community can really use the recreational spaces and are drawn to those than, say, the conservation spaces, which are more meant for conservation. I also think the map here on the right is a really nice example of how conventional subdivision development that you see in sort of that beigeish yellow on the right compares to open space subdivisions, where you have this on the right, you have this regularized set of sort of square parcels that are relatively large, and then you look to the left and you see small parcels with homes clustered, and then these large open spaces, conserving wetlands, offering play fields, and being connected through a sidewalk system. And connecting, also the purple here is connecting into the town's trail system. So it's sort of became linked up to a wider set of open space resources. So a pretty cool example. Pennsylvania in general, higher density development than you'd see in lots of New Hampshire, but this part of Pennsylvania is certainly similar to like parts of southern New Hampshire. All right, so now I want to pass it to Jacob LaFontaine from the town of Salem. So I think, I think Jacob, if you just want to run through some of your examples and your town's experience of open space preservation development, I think for the folks on the call, it might feel like a little more real how the process works and what the concerns might be.
Thank you, June. I'd be happy to. I'm Jacob LaFontaine. I'm the planning director in Salem, and I'm happy to give an overview of our experience here in Salem. This is a useful map that NOAA produced, and we use this to present to our Conservation Commission and our planning board in the town at large when we looked at revising our open space preservation ordinance. I met with NOAA in June earlier, and we talked about the fact that the majority of communities in New Hampshire have a cluster ordinance or an open space ordinance on the books, but they've seen varying levels of success with that. Here in Salem, we've seen some success. We adopted our ordinance in 1990. Ross Moldoff was a longtime planning director, and he was a strong advocate for it. He tried a couple of times in the 1980s to get a ordinance passed. I think at the time it might have been a cluster ordinance, and it was denied. And some of it was, how you market the proposal to the community. But ultimately, it was passed in 1990. We had our first subdivisions come in 1992. And since 1992, we've had 30 open space subdivisions in Salem. Those have yielded 564 single family dwellings and also 772 acres of permanently preserved open space. So I think that's certainly a huge success and a credit to Ross's efforts in this town. I won't spend too much time on this ordinance. This is our purpose statement, and it's pretty consistent with the purposes that June ran through in terms of, obviously you want to preserve the open space, you want reduced utilities and infrastructure, which is a benefit for the developer, and then recreational aesthetics and amenities. So we go through that, and I would like to note that our process here in Goffstown is by right. We do allow it. There's no special exception required. We do ask you have to have 15 acres, but we do have a waiver provision, which I'll talk about in a little bit. If you have 25 acres, you're eligible for a density bonus. But the first step in that process is to produce a yield plan to show that you can accommodate the number of lots on a conventional subdivision. And one of the problems that we experience with this is that the yield plan often overstates the number of lots. So you'll notice, for instance, lot 10, there's probably about a 40-foot wetland crossing that would need to be permitted and built to actually access that single family dwelling, which if you're in land use, you probably understand is a very unlikely expenditure for a developer to make. And there's some other things too. Lot 1 you'll see is almost entirely encompassed by our wetland setbacks and buffers. But it's a process. You go through the process, you meet with the Conservation Commission. And in Salem, we talked about the intent and what the master plan goals are. And ours are tied to housing production, but they've also been predominantly tied to ecology and the emphasis on conservation and preservation. So this was they revised this application eventually, and they relocated lot 10 so that it had a driveway easement through lot 9. And the planning board was okay with that. This is how the subdivision was constructed, but you'll notice that a lot of the open space, this is kind of not a great image because our prime wetland buffer is in yellow, and then the open space is also the yellow overlay, but the darker yellow is our prime wetland, and the lighter yellow is the open space with some wetland intermittently in between. In a lot of that land, there's 31 acres, but the majority of it is wetland, and the upland is bisected by the wetland. So it's, we reviewed this and we wanted to have some trail connectivity and some use of the upland, but it becomes very difficult. So one of our solutions, we recently amended our ordinance to have a density bonus incentive to further good design. And it's a density schedule. Previously, we didn't have this. So these are kind of the objectives that we'd like to take from the open space subdivisions. We'd like to have, if you can designate 70% is a lot, but if you can do that, then you get 5%. If you can have a public access, agricultural land use bonus. So these are the varieties of density bonuses that we try to encourage so that we can get the type of subdivision, the thoughtful type and purposeful type of subdivision that we envision by the open space preservation ordinance. And cumulatively, they can meet 10%. We used to have it at 20%. I think we could potentially revisit, maybe increasing, because if you're able to, on this schedule, accumulate 20%, I think you probably could argue that you certainly earned the additional development. This is an example of a recent subdivision that came in 2022. Obviously, it's not shown here. This is the aerial prior to the development, but you can see where the road network went in. And one of the things that we note here is that when the subdivisions go in, fewer mature trees can be preserved. If you have a conventional subdivision in Salem, we have a 50-foot no-cut buffer along the street. So you preserve a visual buffer, and the houses are set back, and the houses aren't as visible. Here, obviously, the development's clustered in one location, but because you need to put wells and septics and the other infrastructure, you're pretty much clearing the entirety of the site where the houses are going to be located. One of the things that we do to mitigate this is that we require that street trees be planted along the road so that it can kind of preserve some of the character of the area. But ultimately, I think it is a benefit because when you zoom out, most of the open space is in the rear of the site, but we've preserved 30 acres of permanently protected open space here, which is contiguous to another open space development that you can see on the left. And I do think it's a benefit. I mean, ideally, we maybe kind of have more use, a trail network, but I think the contiguous open space is great for wildlife habitat. Another problem that we talk about is the development may look more crowded than conventional subdivisions. I guess if you're from a more densely populated place, this probably isn't all that shocking, but this is in our rural district, and you can see the 4 house lots. Obviously, if it's 2-acre lots with 30 foot setbacks, they're not going to be clustered quite like this. And a part of that is because they're clearing the entirety of the site. So one of the things that we recommend is that you identify and preserve site features and vegetation. Here you can see there are some mature trees that were preserved during the process of the construction of the subdivision. And I think that's a great benefit. Obviously, we have subdivisions from 1992 and the vegetation's been established and they look great, but I think preserving the characteristics that you can is an important part of this. This is an example of an open space subdivision. This was one of the first ones that came in. We preserved a large swath of open space right along the Spigot River, which is a prime wetland, and then we situated the houses further away. And we also have a buffer from the street here, that's Bridge Street, and I think they've done a pretty good job here of meeting the intent. And there's a trail system as well.
Hey, Jacob, can I just chime in for a minute? We got a question, I think, on one of the earlier slides, that initial slide that just showed the big lawn out in back of one of the house. Does the public have access to that space?
On I can go back to, we're talking about the original, this one probably here.
I don't know if it was that one or one of that first actual picture of the house, Lorraine Ave one.
Oh, Lorraine Ave. Yeah, there's, you can see kind of where there's a vegetative finger that kind of comes down between the drainage basin, and we do have public access provided in that area. There's not an established trail system network, so it makes it kind of difficult, but we're hoping that, there'll be some utilization of it, and there's the potential that there's adjacent properties that are larger that might get developed, and we would at that time ask for connections. They had difficulty providing much of you can see, I think, from this image here, where you see the deciduous trees that have kind of turned colors, that's where the majority of the wetland is. So when we asked for them to provide passive recreation, they said that they were pretty limited without, a wetland crossing and some additional efforts there.
Great. We also got a comment from Sandy Crystal. I don't know if you care to comment on this. I believe sits on the Bow Conservation Commission. Yield plans need to pass the straight face test. Also, open space can be required to consist of a certain percentage of buildable upland so that we are not protecting what is essentially protected already.
Yeah, and in Salem, we've struggled with this. Our previous ordinance required that 50% of the gross land be preserved as open space. And what we did is we modified that, and we asked, which is, maybe someone might argue prohibitive, but we asked for 50% of the upland to be preserved, because what was happening is a lot of the times we were just getting all of the wetland that were being preserved, and it was difficult for us to really justify that it met the spirit and intent of our ordinance in terms of the open space. I see a question about what is this straight face test, and I think that's just the developer oftentimes wants to acknowledge that they can site as many houses as possible, because that means they can site those on a smaller plan. So we do have that reviewed by our planning board, and they were critical. I think I showed that yield plan before, and they were critical because the developer showed a 40-foot wetland crossing for a single family dwelling, and ultimately showed a potential 400-foot driveway easement, and the board, I think, felt that was acceptable. But you do need, I think, to look through it and see if the conventional subdivision that's proposed is actually something that is feasible in application. So this is another problem that we have in terms of the open space subdivisions and its encroachments. You'll notice this was one of our early developments. You can see that row of pine trees, and that's how we tried to delineate the open space by providing that row of pines. Of course, over time, pines they either get cut down or they die, and ultimately the homeowners use them as extensions of their yards. You can see that here. This was really a well thought out idea. We wanted to provide potential future connection to a rural parcel next door that we envisioned would be developed as open space. And in the interim, somebody thought it would be a great place to house their vehicle. This was a more unusual one, but this is the open space to the left. That's the pine trees that mark the buffer. And my assumption is that that's a pet memorial, but it is located in the open space. So all sorts of interesting encroachments. These are the more serious ones. This is you can see the tracks that go out to this location here highlighted in red, and they've cut into the vegetation, and they're using that to put their yard clip-ins. Obviously, these are smaller lots, so they don't have the ability really to put yard waste on their property. So they go out and they bring it to the open space. They dump it in there. There's also construction material and debris. So it becomes an enforcement issue. We post this sign, and keeps most people honest. Some people are going to continue to ignore it, and then it is a code enforcement issue at that point. But something to be mindful of. One of the solutions we've come to is that we have all of our boundaries delineated with physical markers. So these are various conservation signs that we have located along the boundaries of conservation open space subdivisions. This is another example. This is Hawkins Glen, and I think they've done a really great job. They've preserved the view shed along Town Farm Road, which is a rural road. They've set the houses far back. They have, which you can see here, actually, this is a great view of how far back the houses are set. And if you're on Town Farm Road, you don't even know that there's so many 60 some odd houses, I think, back in that area. This is that view from the street. They've also got recreational amenities. Those are important. We saw a couple of slides ago on Meadow Glen, you saw that common open space, and it was established for conservation purposes, but there's been an issue where kids are using it consistently as a recreation field, and all hours of the night the neighbors are complaining, which is understandable because the lots are smaller and there's less room to recreate on the individual lots. But here they were purposeful about it. They have a clubhouse that is owned in common. They've got a trail network that you can see that crosses over the wetland there. And I think they've done a really good job here. This is an example in Goffstown, and I use this initially. Our open space ordinance did not accommodate recreational uses. And I use this to illustrate, you can see obviously from that house lot that there's a lot of grade there. Those are somewhat tough sites, and it'd probably be tough to kick a ball around on that lot. So what they did is they preserved the open spaces in the rear of the site, and then highlighted in red is those recreational facilities that you can see in the image here. And I think that's a great idea. One of the issues obviously is maintenance. It's kind of the tragedy of the commons, and you just got to make sure that you have a strong homeowner association to maintain those amenities. In Salem, I saw there was a question in the chat about why has Salem been successful, and I think there's a couple of reasons why we have been. I think one is because we allow it by right, and we also allow the planning board to waive not only the dimensional criteria, but also the minimum lot size. So we allow, our ordinance requires lots of 15 acres to be eligible for the open space subdivision. And we allow the planning board to waive that. So in this case, it was a smaller lot. I believe it was, must have been 12 acres or so. And we waived the 15 acre requirement. The open space here is 8 acres in size, and then you have 4 additional house lots that are produced this way. The yield plan, if you look at it, it would have been a lot of infrastructure to run to make 4 house lots conform with our ordinance. You'd have to build the street to town standards. You'd have to build all the other infrastructure, and ultimately the return is 4 house lots, where now you've got 4 frontage lots and no costs for infrastructure. This is Aurora Woods. I think they've done a great job here too as well. The Zion Hill on the left-hand side is Salem's only designated scenic road, and they've set the development away from that area. A lot of the open space is wetland, but you'll notice in the middle of the development is a large kind of village green idea where that's utilized by all the residents of the development, and it gets high utilization, and I think it's a great benefit for the development and for the residents that live there. So in terms of solutions that we'd recommend, it, we require a conceptual plan. We ask them if they want the density bonus, that is. We ask them to come in advance, review the conceptual plans with the planning board, and the Conservation Commission. We recommend a site visit is conducted so that we can identify those valuable environmental features that we want to protect. We ask them to specify the proposed use of the open space, which oftentimes is a little difficult because sometimes it's the leftover land, and what we want them to do is say, how is this going to be utilized? The one on Cottonwood, now that we've amended our ordinance, we would ask them to state specifically what the intent is. I think they have a good idea because it's contiguous to an existing open space subdivision, and they're preserving wildlife habitat. So I think that would be the rationale there. We also want the open space boundaries delineated. We want pedestrian access and landscaping requirements. We want those street trees along the street to enhance the residential character. We have that density bonus to further good design. And then the big thing, I think, is those dimensional requirements that we allow the planning board the ability to waive the requirements if the plan makes sense. So that's been our experience in Salem. I think that we've had a lot of good fortune here in Salem, and I hope that we continue to. Our land here is getting pretty built out, so I don't know how many 25-acre parcels, 15-acre parcels there are remaining, but we don't see too many large conventional subdivisions. We do see smaller 3-lot, 4-lot subdivisions here and there, but anything greater, 10 or more typically is coming in under our open space ordinance, and I think it's the flexibility that we offer. And that does conclude my portion of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I think Salem is just such an amazing example of a cluster ordinance that's really been utilized and adapted itself to the needs of the moment, and has found ways to recognize and address some of the difficulties that can come with open space development. There are some questions in the chat. Also, hi folks, I'm now on video. Thank you, teams. But there's some questions in the chat that I'll read here. Are there examples of adopted ordinances that vary the lot sizes and housing types / sizes to address mixed income and rural character objectives? This is a great question. I have not seen a lot of that type of variation. And Jacob and Noah, feel free to jump in here if you have examples that come to mind. I'm sort of curious, Beth, are you thinking about variation within a single ordinance or just variations in sort of approaches? And then maybe if you respond to that in the chat, I'll also just ask Stephanie's question to Jacob here. Do you have a minimum or maximum lot sizes?
Well, we do. In our rural district, the underlying requirement is 2 acres, but in our open space subdivision ordinance, if you're zoned rural, so presumably you're on septic, so that can be reduced to 25,000 square feet. If you're on sewer, then it's reduced to 15,000 square feet. But again, the planning board has the ability to waive the lot requirement if it's in limited respects. So applicant could go and they could say that they can make an argument for even a smaller lot, the 25,000. It could be that they can accommodate the septic system on a smaller lot, and the planning board could review that and they could decide whether or not they want to allow that.
Oh no, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, my apologies. I was going to add in response to I think Beth's earlier question about, I don't know of specific examples of ordinance to vary the lot sizes, but I think I would just say that I think that cluster is not the only tool to do this, to both vary the lot sizes and address the mixed income while retaining rural character. I know another tool in the toolbox, which hasn't been widely used, but which could get at some of this kind of objectives, Beth, that you're talking about, is the village plan alternative tool that provides a little bit more flexibility there, trying to get the mix of lot sizes, mix of uses, while still having that focus on retaining rural character. Again, I think something like 5 communities have village plan alternative ordinances on the books. And I'll put the link to the OPD municipal land use survey where we have that. But I'm not aware of any actual ordinances that have actually been used to produce that kind of development.
Yeah, I'll say I can't think of any real examples that have like variations of lot sizes or home sizes within it. I do think there's probably some room to get creative, sort of within the framework of also a workforce housing ordinance that could sort of blend the requirements that often are seen in workforce housing ordinances in with cluster. And in fact, a lot of workforce housing ordinances are structured a lot like cluster. So we can think of some examples that are called workforce housing ordinances, but are sort of structurally very similar to this. Minimum maximum lot sizes also is I think a useful tool. You don't see maximums a lot in the code, but I do, some communities definitely, some communities definitely use them. More often you see it structured as like, minimum preserved space or minimum open space that sort of ends up being the governing rule for maximum lot size. But then I'll echo also the village plan alternative, such a cool tool that we'd certainly like to see implemented more often. So there's a question in the chat. Many of the density bonus calculations can get very complicated. Is this seen as a barrier by developers? I think, well, the way that Salem has structured it, I think is fairly interesting, is that the bonus is sort of laid out for what kinds of, what kinds of community benefits the town is receiving in response, and they sort of stack up on one another until you hit a sort of maximum density bonus. And I think that's a useful way to do it while still retaining like the flexibility. I think there's room to get sort of creative with sort of workforce housing in there as well. Like most of Salem's are focused on design, which is like super important. But then when we get into workforce housing questions as well, there's some bonus you could do there. And that could be almost a very simple formula, though one that as almost a pseudo inclusionary zoning thing would require some financial analysis to make work.
Yeah, I would just add, I think before we kind of allowed just a blanket density bonus, and I would guarantee that the developer sees that as less of a barrier than our scheduled approach. But what we're trying to do is try to find a balance between the two, where I did say that our intention of the open space preservation was tied a lot to the conservation aspect of our master plan, and we're trying to strike that balance between the density bonus and then also getting the desired design that we want or that we'd like to see for an open space subdivision. So
there's a few questions in the chat, one about private roads, HOA fees, etc. And then a question about specific criteria for planning board to waive lot sizes. Those, I think both those questions are like, as many ideas as you have about how a cluster ordinance could be structured, there exists an implementation of that in the law. And then in terms of HOA fees, I think some, some of these cluster communities do have active HOAs, which would have HOA fees that sort of pay for the maintenance, but not every cluster community does. And that ends up becoming like a real barrier to, or it creates long-term hassle, I think, for everyone involved. There should be, an active HOA. There should be a sort of way to manage the spaces in the community, any private roads, any sort of private trails. Not every developer goes through the sort of administrative work to make that happen up front. And it really needs to be developer led and with some likely hand-holding or at least monitoring by local government. And to Justin's comment, wouldn't a developer welcome more lots and want a smaller space and avoid paying for longer roads? Yes, absolutely. As long as they can do it without the risk of, I don't know, a long process that leads nowhere. I think there's that sort of like risk reward proposition, and I'm certainly not like an advocate of like let them build no matter what, like make it all happen, build. But long discretionary processes can make developers particularly skittish. A long-term landowner, maybe not, but a developer who's leveraged and paying for holding costs, they might look at a long process for discretionary review and be like, ooh, I can't swing that. So that's my only thought there. It is after 1. So I am happy to stick around and do more Q&A, but in the interest of people's time, I think we'll also just mention the other trainings we have going on. So I'll just actually take control here. So this is our second in 5 trainings, not 3rd and 6th. So we did a toolbox overview last week. We did open space cluster housing this week. Next week, we'll do transfer of development rights, which is a tool for sort of shifting development capacity around in a way that accomplishes many of the same preservation goals that we see cluster housing going for. RSA 79E is the week following. So that's sort of tax relief for housing, and that will cover both sort of traditional 79E, which is aimed at redevelopment, and newly passed housing opportunity zones. And then at the end of the month, we're going to talk form-based codes, which are a tool that are used particularly in like downtown or village areas to make development more intuitive and make sure the community gets results that it actually wants. So I'm happy to stick around more, or if folks want to jump off, feel free to do so. Comment in the chat from Lynn. Bias towards municipal roads and public spaces and away from HOAs. Don't fully understand the benefits and why HRAs are what we see so much of now. I mean, I think a lot of good arguments there. I think one that comes to mind in sort of favor of the HOA management would just be ongoing carrying costs by the municipality and administrative capacity of, say, the Conservation Commission, of making sure the open spaces are conserved in the way they are meant to be. But of course, that duty still falls to them anyhow. So I don't know. I'd be welcome to arguments in favor as well.
Jacob, did you have anything else to add before we've wrapped up, or?
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, I'd be happy to talk with anybody. If you'd like, reach out, and I'd love to share our experience in Salem with anyone who's interested.
Great, and I did put in the chat, Jacob, what I think is the correct link to Salem's open space residential subdivision regulations for anybody who wants to take a look at those.
Perfect. Yeah, that's the correct link.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time on a Thursday afternoon. And I hope to see you at future trainings.